There, in the myths, they thought they could find things that would be useful for their work, or that could help them explain things better. For example, if you look at the Symposium, Plato talks about Eros in the Symposium, as you know. To explain philosophy, or to describe what philosophy is, he says that philosophy is a kind of Eros.
Hello to everyone from the Istanbul School, dear viewers. This week, Associate Professor Dr. Nihal Petek Boyacı is with us again. Welcome, Professor.
Oh, thanks for having me.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Thank you very much. Professor, last week we talked about ancient philosophy. We talked about the birth of philosophy and the Sophists. In this episode, we also want to talk a bit about mythology. What is the place of mythology in philosophy? How do you interpret it?
Now, when we generally look at it, it seems like there was a period of mythologies before the process that started with Thales. People used to explain everything that happened with myths, or with mythos. And then those explanations were no longer enough, and suddenly it's as if we switched to rational thought, and we talk about the beginning of philosophical thinking as if these two are completely separate poles. But actually, we use myths within philosophy itself. So when we look at philosophers, at the philosophers of ancient philosophy, we can't really say that there was a complete break. For example, if we look at Empedocles among the Presocratics, Empedocles actually explains his 4 basic elements with gods and goddesses. But the fact that he explains it this way doesn't mean that it's a myth. But by using the gods or goddesses from the Olympian pantheon, he's actually trying to explain his own understanding of existence. Or, for example, when we look at Plato's Republic, he actually places a myth at the very foundation of the state. And this myth explains that it's possible to move between classes, that in the 3-class system, everyone actually has something different in their nature, and so on a Phoenician myth, or the myth of the metals. Some call it the myth of the metals, but we can also refer to it as the Phoenician myth. So, in fact, they're not avoiding the use of myths within philosophy at all. In other words, they're not suddenly engaging in purely abstract philosophy. On the contrary, they actually use myths whenever they think it will serve their purpose, be useful to them, or help them explain things better. For example, if you look at Plato's Symposium, he openly talks about Eros and says that philosophy has its own Eros in order to explain philosophy or to describe what philosophy is. It's like the thing between the ignorant and the truly wise. In other words, the ignorant person doesn't actually practice philosophy, and neither does the wise person. Because one simply doesn't know, and the other never feels the need. But philosophy is actually something in between these two. And to explain this, he uses Eros. He explains this to us through the mythological parents of Eros. So, in fact, when we try to bring philosophy or philosophical thought to everyone or explain it, we make use of myths. But this doesn't mean the following. It's not that they just take the myth and keep going with it to do philosophy. Rather, they take what they need from it, and then, of course, a kind of philosophical thinking, which is what we call rational thinking or deep thinking or trying to explain existence, knowledge, or whatever it is we're pursuing, comes into play. So, when we look at it, we can't really talk about such a clear-cut break. But there is a change in thinking. In other words, we can say that there's a transition from blind belief to a way of thinking where we question and reflect on what things really are.
So, who were the prominent philosophers of this era, and what were their teachings? Let's talk about these a bit.
When we look at it broadly, if you check out an ancient philosophy book, like Savitsai's book, for example, it's the same there too. There's actually a classification within ancient philosophy. For instance, there's Hellenic philosophy and Hellenistic philosophy. You start with Hellenic philosophy, which is called the pre-Socratic period. Or they're called the Presocratics. The Presocratics, the Sophists. In fact, maybe it would be more accurate to call them the pre-Sophists rather than the Presocratics. But it's as if there's this big chronology. After the Sophists, we separate it as the systematic period. When you look at it, it seems as if all of their problems are different from each other. It's often said that with the Sophists, philosophy started to focus on humans. As if no.
As if before, people.
As if people had never thought about these things, or had never reflected on values in any way. One of the reasons for that classification, of course, is that Aristotle called the Presocratics physikoi. In other words, he labeled them as people who did a kind of natural philosophy and thought about nature. I already mentioned this in the previous part. Actually, they weren't just looking at what being is, or what the main substance of being is. I mean, there are some other fragments as well. Of course, when you inevitably question being, there are fragments related to knowledge. But we also know that there are some fragments related to ethics or even politics. For example, when we look at Heraclitus, it's very significant that he calls war the father of everything. Because, in fact, under the threat that Ephesus would never assert its own existence without opposing anything, they immediately accept that threat. Later on, another city-state helps them, and they're actually able to continue their existence, but they themselves do not fight a war. So, he thinks that fighting is actually a way of asserting one's existence. We can also say that this has certain political implications. But when we look at it from this perspective, in the broadest sense, yes, they have reflected on nature and have said certain things about it. When we look from Thales to Democritus, all those so-called Presocratics say this. But that doesn't mean they don't say anything beyond this. In other words, they also take up certain problems related to their own environment or issues concerning their own lives. Maybe those parts just haven't reached us, of course. We don't know about that. Because, as I said, we only know what has been fully passed down to us or what has been transmitted to us, so we only see the parts that others have chosen to include. Well, of course, the sophists are important. I actually talked a bit about the sophists in the previous episode as well. I think they're a group that needed to appear on the stage of the history of philosophy. But in my opinion, the most crucial turning point is the period that begins with Socrates. And I kind of really put Socrates right there.
A Socrates fan.
Yes, I place him there very clearly. The most prominent, or actually the one who affects us more deeply, that's partly because of something else, of course. Theory needs to go hand in hand with practice. Just knowing the theory, or no matter how well you know what justice is, if you never put it into practice, it doesn't mean anything. So this affects us a lot. Of course, there are also things we're influenced by when we look at what happened to Socrates. But at the core, he's the one who most clearly shows us how we should live, with that idea that an unexamined life is not worth living. Yes, exactly, because he told us that we can place him in a very clear spot. But when we look at the period after him, Plato and Aristotle, of course, they're not to be underestimated either. We could say they basically laid the foundation for almost the entire history of philosophy, but they also owe their existence in part to the Presocratics. In other words, they build on the ideas that came before them. Can we actually see this as a kind of chain? I think we can. We can see it very clearly. Then, of course, there are the Socratic schools in between as well. So they're part of it too. The Hellenistic period is even more interesting. For example, it meets the needs of that period. In the Hellenistic period, it's more about ethics or things related to life, because the way of life is changing. So what exactly is changing? First of all, we're no longer living in the form of a polis, for example. Since the way of life is changed and people now need different things and are under the influence of something else, the way philosophy is practiced there also changes. Therefore, when we look at all of them, when we view them through a single window, we can say that each one is actually very valuable in terms of the era they lived in, the place they lived, and the ideas they produced. Is it really right to put one ahead of the others just because of where they were or when they lived? I'm not sure about that, but each one has its own unique value. So let's bring it to the present, Professor. How can the philosophies and philosophers of antiquity contribute to doing philosophy today or not doing it, or to knowing the history of philosophy? Why do we need to learn this? Isn't it the most basic question of all, for example? Why should we know the history of philosophy? If a person is already thinking for themselves, reflecting on concepts, and considering their own problems, then I can do philosophy without knowing the entire history of philosophy. In fact, knowing a certain way of doing philosophy also comes from knowing the history of philosophy. First of all, you avoid rediscovering something that already exists. There are already certain ideas that have been expressed. You reflect on those ideas. So, why should I learn ancient philosophy? That's probably one of the questions students ask the most, right? Because at first they say, let's just learn contemporary philosophy and nothing else. But actually, from the very beginning, you also start to learn a certain style of doing philosophy. How do these philosophers do it? This is where we start. The problem's here. In other words, the problems in ancient times, even though the systems of government and locations were different, are still fundamental human problems. I mean, back then we were debating what justice is. And today, we're still debating what justice is. The context, the content, or certain aspects of it might change depending on the time or place. But that's not the point. These changes don't lead us to an absolute conclusion anyway. So, no matter how much Plato gives us a definition of justice, if we look at the Hellenistic period later on, or if we look at Aristotle, we see that justice is defined with a different perspective. Therefore, the concepts or problems we focus on or pursue don't actually change. We have almost the same problems, but our answers are different, or the path we take is a bit different, or our questions branch out even more. Let me put it this way. When I look back at Plato, for example, there are certain criticisms in Plato about the type of person found in a democracy, and I really love that passage, that part in the Republic. He says, sometimes he makes a description of the democratic person in the Republic. Sometimes he says, for example, he sits under a tree and lies there all day, but then suddenly decides to learn philosophy, or sometimes he goes and eats certain things, does other things. He's actually describing exactly the kind of person we call the consumer today. What does consumer mean? It's someone who wants something different every day, who is one thing one day and something else the next, and even thinks they can be whatever they want. Someone who never really stops consuming, who is constantly consuming, but does all this without actually having any real knowledge. If we took Plato's description of the democratic person from back then and showed it to people today, without saying it was Plato who said it, they'd say, oh, that's just like people today. So in reality, nothing has really changed about human beings themselves. In other words, at the core, there's nothing that's really changed about people's problems or the way people live. So when we look back at antiquity, of course, it's not like we're going to take Plato's idea of a kind of knowledge aristocracy and bring it into our time. I mean, that's already a utopian idea anyway. But at the very least, when we're trying to come up with some solutions, we can take the critiques from back then, reflect on them again, and as we move forward, or let's say, in our pursuit of some kind of truth, even though we're not going to chase after the idea of the good anymore, we are still searching for a truth. So, what is it that we desire? For example, maybe a basic definition of justice, or, say, some fundamental principles. Think about human rights. In fact, we're also chasing after something universal. But when we look at it, things still aren't working out. I mean, today it's as if we act like we've solved everything and have no problems left. But whatever problems existed in ancient times, they still persist today because people are still the same. There are just different issues now, brought on by technology, things that didn't exist back then. But as I said, even in those times there were questions of justice and so on. So,
Our fundamental problems are always the same, actually.
actually they're the same. It's just that, as I said, the content changes a little bit. So how does this help us? What these people said is important. I mean, what did they say? What did they tell us? How did they criticize things? Today, for example, I could take that criticism of democracy and agree with it 100%. Or, for example, if you look at Aristotle's concept of potential and actual, it seems like it only belongs to that era and that we'll never deal with it again. But when you look at one of today's most prominent philosophers, like Nussbaum, for example, she's an Aristotelian. In fact, humans have a philosophy based on realizing their potential. It's all about capabilities. Now, this is a very important point. So we're relying on that, but actually everyone has the potential to accomplish certain things. And when we trace it back in the history of philosophy, it leads us to Aristotle. And we also need to know why we do what we do. That's why, instead of reinventing the wheel, it seems like we can take what's already there, build on it, bring it into the present, and offer some solutions based on today's context. For example, when we look back, we'll turn to Stoicism. But what use does Stoicism have for us today? Actually, today, there's something we call conscious awareness or mindfulness.
It's become really popular lately.
Yes, things like personal development and so on. When we look back at it, what do we see? We actually see Stoicism. They're literally talking about something stoic. If there are people who consciously teach things about mindfulness or conscious awareness, they usually start by turning to Stoicism. So it's about Stoicism, that universal understanding of humanity. They start with the cycle of the whole universe there, and then move on to mindfulness, which is the contemporary part today. So, in fact, many things that we think have nothing to do with each other today can actually be found in ancient philosophy, or it doesn't even have to be ancient times. You can also find them in the Middle Ages. These are things we can find in the history of philosophy when we look back. In other words, these are things we base our ideas on. That's why, especially when we look at these personal development experts,
we see these meditations and mindfulness practices everywhere all the time.
Exactly. It's not really something you can do well without knowing philosophy, because you need to know the foundation of why you're saying what you're saying. I mean, when you tell someone we're going to do it this way, or this is something that can be thought of like this, it's actually something that's already been said before. I mean, this exists in Stoicism. If you go there, the person who's learning will know how to learn and what to look for, and after reading a bit of Stoicism, they can actually understand it much more clearly. That's why knowing the history of philosophy is important. I'm not saying we have to go all the way back to ancient times, but knowing the history of philosophy matters. Because today, a lot of things, many things we talk about regarding human beings today, can actually be traced back to that era. For example, if I go back to the Presocratics again, as I mentioned in the previous episode, I talked about Kerathane. Kerathane, for instance, has a claim like this: especially in the debates about the primary substance of existence, to assign a single essence to each one. For example, to say that the primary substance of existence is water. There would no longer be anything that makes you different from me. What does that mean? It means that not just people, but actually this chair, this table, this book, or even this flower, none of them are any different from you or me. Where do I go from here? Actually, from here, I arrive at a kind of identification between nature and humans. This identification isn't a particularly dangerous one, because it's not like that. It's not like I'm assigning a specific essence and, well, no, it's not like that either. But what is it really? For example, when I harm nature, it's like I'm objecting to something that comes from the same root as myself. When you go back and look at it from that perspective, for instance, when we discuss today's climate crisis, we can also see through the Presocratics just how wrong humanity's domination is.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much for your valuable comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Dear viewers, our guest this week was Associate Professor Dr. Nihal Petek Boyacı. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.